All right, welcome back. So in episode 1, I laid out the headline. Christian-coded moral language works like a coordination technology, and the attention economy functions like a selection machine. It doesn't reward what you intended, it rewards what spreads. So today we're not doing metaphysics, we're not doing proof God, we're not doing religion good, religion bad. We're doing something way more practical and honestly, more uncomfortable. So welcome to the Suburban Saturn. Here we're going to take a look at two archetypes of Christian civilization champions in the online ecosystem, one from the 2018 era and the other one from now, and ask the algorithm what it selects for. Because this is where the conversation gets real. Not in the I have a hot take sense, but in the we can watch what happens in the wild sense. Here's the core premise for this episode. There are two different technologies at play. One is IRL formation, embodied, accountable, relational. People see you, people know you. You can't just posture forever because your life shows up in the room. The other is online Christian identity discourse, which is incentive distorted and optimized for badges, boundaries, and escalation. It's not designed to produce neighbors, it's designed to produce signal. And when those two layers couple, when you try to use IRL formation energy, but then you plug it into an online recruiting and coordination layer, you create a seam. And that seam is where incoherence starts leaking into the project. Sermon on the Mount vibes in person, us versus them scripts online. Your nervous system doesn't live in that contradiction for long. It resolves by exit or splitting or hypocrisy. Now, before I go in on the online ecosystem, there's an irony I need to name because it matters and it's personal. When I first came up on YouTube, the online right wasn't a faint background hum, it was the ocean, the default waters we swam in. You could find Jared Taylor content floating around like it was a normal opinion. You'd see explicitly racialized politics. You had replacement theory everywhere. You had people doing the Western civilization is Christian and must be defended thing with zero subtlety. And you had this convergence happening. Outright energy, early Daily Wire energy. Ben Shapiro's Facts Don't Care About Your Feelings, Milo, the whole IDW orbit forming, and then the media industrial complex reacting to it like it was the literal end of civilization. And that was the environment. And then Jordan Peterson becomes a kind of weird upgrade patch. Because if you were a young man online, especially if you were disaffected and hungry for meaning, Peterson gave you something that a lot of the ecosystem didn't. He gave you sincerity, he gave you vulnerability, and he gave you moral seriousness without immediately turning the other side into demons. He could be very combative, he could be very intense, he could be sharp, he could be a moral outrageous person. He was a character. The algorithm loves that. It served him and it served him. Slice after slice after slice after slice. But he kept a tethered to the humanity on the other person. He did this thing, sometimes annoying, sometimes brilliant, where he would try to model your internal world if he thought you were wrong. He'd psychoanalyze you, not just to dunk on you, but so he could build a theory of mind. He treated disagreement as a tragic human drama more than a cosmic extermination narrative. And there were those moments, if you watched him in that era, where he'd break down talking about suffering, responsibility, encouraging each other, the fragility of life, the burden of being a person. Whether you agreed with him or not, you could feel the ethic in his posture. Don't turn pain into cruelty. Don't let bitterness metastasize. Build a life that's stable enough to love people. And that's why, and I'm going to say this plainly, he softened me to Christianity. Because between us, at the time I was basically an anti-theist. I had deep reasons for it, some personal, some historical, some structural. I saw religion as control technology. I saw gaslighting. I saw the way metaphysics becomes a weapon. I had that classic internet posture of this needs to be eradicated rhetorically. Peterson didn't make me Christian, but he made me stop seeing Christians as a monolith of enemies. Because his Christianity wasn't war, it was meaning, suffering, character, responsibility, humility, a kind of moral poetry with civilizational stakes. Now here's the point. Even that version had a risk. Peterson's move was essentially, Christianity is true in an anthropological sense, true as a mythic operating system that helps humans coordinate and survive and not eat each other alive. And he refused to clearly answer the revelatory metaphysics questions in the way Sam Harris wanted. He wouldn't just say, yes, I believe in the resurrection, or no, I don't. That ambiguity is not just an academic quirk. It turns Christianity into a floating banner. And once Christianity becomes a floating banner, it becomes identity language, much like the woke language. Once it becomes identity language, the algorithm can select for whatever version of that identity produces the most engagement. Which brings us to now. Fast forward to 2026 and look at who becomes dominant in the Christian moral language online environment. A lot of those young men who were moved by Peterson's meaning and responsibility vibe aren't living under that banner anymore. They're downstream of a different set of champions, more cynical, more cruel, more certain, and way more willing to turn politics into spiritual warfare. And this is where someone like Candace Owens becomes a clean archetype. Not because she's the only one, not because she's the root of everything, but because her rhetorical pattern is extremely legible. She doesn't merely comment on events, she makes the audience part of the cosmic, divine, participatory plot of God. And that's the key. She pulls you inside a story where you're not just watching history. You're enlisted in it. You're a soldier in it. You're the righteous remnant. You're the one who sees through the lies. And then she uses biblical categories as categories of persons, satanic, demonic, evil, not as poetry, as social sorting. And once you do that, disagreement isn't a difference of judgment, it becomes spiritual pathology. The person isn't mistaken, they're corrupted. They're possessed by ideology as demon. They're part of the entity. That rhetorical move has consequences. It dehumanizes, it escalates, it makes enemies, it makes conflict feel virtuous, it makes cruelty feel like clarity. And the reason I'm naming this is not because it's rare. You see the same move in miniature formats all over the place. Those Jubilee-style debates where you put Christians across the New Age folks or secular folks, and the Christian folks can't help but default to that's demonic, we're doing satanic work, you're living in sin, we're trying to save you. That's not personality, that's an affordance of revelatory frameworks. When you believe you're anchored to divine truth, disagreement becomes rebellion. The rebellion becomes moral contamination, and the moral contamination becomes exile. Now, here's the part that actually matters for this series. So the algorithm doesn't necessarily choose Christianity. It inadvertently chooses whatever engages people the most and will serve them that, right? It's not trying to be malicious, and it's not trying to be biased towards a specific religion. It simply selects for whatever gets more engagement across different major categorical populations like Christians or Muslims, etc. So it's not necessarily that it's being malicious and it's trying to recruit people and it's trying to arouse them or anger them. It just happens to be the case that most people tend to engage with things that make them angry and make them upset, irate. And so what I am trying to suggest is that it inadvertently chooses then what recruits and arouses and produces boundary and clarity. It chooses what loops attention. And the algorithm never taps you on the shoulder and says, hey man, you've had enough moral certainty today. Go take a walk, go help your neighbor, call your mom, touch some grass. It just keeps placing cake in front of you, a beer after beer after beer, even though you've had enough, slice after slice after slice after slice. So even if you personally are a Peterson type, humanizing, compassionate, seriously, you can still end up feeding an ecosystem where the Owens type crusade logic becomes a dominant interface, not because you intended that, but because the language becomes a banner and the best recruiters take the banner. That's the selection problem. And it gets even worse when you try to redeploy Christian-coded moral language as a deliberate strategy for social stabilization. Because you don't get to choose which version becomes the viral distribution layer. You can build Beatitude's energy locally, gentle, accountable, neighborly, and then the moment it hits a major platform, it enters a system that rewards outrage, certainty, and boundary enforcement. So here's the system's question in plain terms. If we recharge Christian moral language and it goes viral, what's the probability we get Peterson energy? And what's the probability we get crusade energy? And what are we doing to actively shape that outcome? Because if the answer is we can't control it, we just try it, then you're not doing strategy, you're doing vibes. And vibes are not a defense against selection pressures. Now, I want to make a quick teaser here because later in this series, we're going to go deeper, and I don't want to derail today's episode at all. So I don't want to pretend this is also theoretical, though. The U.S. has already seen deliberate attempts to retool Christianity for political and economic ends. Call it corporate Christianity, call it civic religion projects or whatever, call it a domestic messaging campaign, whatever label you slap on it. The point is, when elites try to rebrand Christianity as a stabilizing moral tool, they don't end up with mercy, they end up with a weapon, and a civic weapon, a moral weapon, and a legitimacy weapon. We'll get into that in later episodes with receipts and citations and a clean historical walkthrough. For now, just keep the shape in mind. This has happened before, which means the capture surface isn't hypothetical, it's in known failure mode. Now, there's one more constraint that Christian revival conversation's constantly underway, and it matters even more if you're talking about real-world coordination. The nones. The unaffiliated, the practice-first crowds, the people who aren't interested in Christianity-forward identity canopies, often for valid reasons that are not angry atheists, cringe nihilists, or hate God. Some are carrying deep institutional harm, some reject revelatory metaphysics on principle, some come from other religious lineages, some simply refuse to pretend they believe what they don't believe in, even if they like the ethics or the literature. And here's the strategic point. The nones aren't a rounding error. They're a major formation. They're not future converts. They're sovereign adults. Many of them are more committed to practice first self-initiation than people who are nostalgically attached to inherited scripts. So any project that recenters Christianity as a default civic interface is making a selection decision. It will select out a portion of the coalition you need for pluralistics common. And it will select people who are more comfortable with revelatory certainty and therefore more vulnerable to crusade logic. And that's not a moral judgment, that's a genuine systems constraint. So where does this leave us then? It leaves us with a clean, brutal adult question. If you want to use Christian moral language as a bridge into real transformation, service, humility, nervous system regulation, practice, then what are the concrete anti-capture mechanisms? What protocols prevent the online layer from cannibalizing the in real life layer? What guardrails keep gentle formation from getting replaced by brand warfare? What design choices keep the nones as first-class citizens rather than collateral damage in a revival they never signed up for? Because if we can answer that, we're not just arguing about religion on the internet, we're designing an exit from the worst incentive gradients of the attention economy. And that's what the series is about. In the next episode, we'll start naming the specific mechanics, how the algorithm rewards certain rhetorical moves, how demon language functions as high-velocity recruitment engine, and what anti-capture designs could look like at the seam between IRL. And yeah, that's it for episode 1. If it resonates, share it with someone who's tired of metaphysical slap fights and wants to talk about the machine we're all living inside, the so-called matrix, right? But it's the so-called matrix. It is a genuine machine, but maybe it is not as coordinated as people may think. And so sometimes ascribing intentions to things that are likely the outcome of incentives, moral intentions specifically, ends up checking out as vibes. So I'm just trying to do my best to keep my analysis in line with what the system's incentives are and how that could potentially backfire when deploying super loaded ideologies in these ecosystems and online, and how as more people on board digitally, they'll have access to these major platforms. And the conversation is completely derailed at this point. So we need to really hash these things out. In any case, things for next time, right?